Our final speaker this afternoon is Brian Rogers. He's working in metallurgical materials engineering at Colorado School of Mines, and he's done 2 residencies, one at Los Alamos National Laboratory in 2022, and one at Lawrence Livermore in 2024. So please, Brian, take it away.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Brian. I'm going to be talking to you today about the microstructure development during rapid solidification in aluminum alloys. So we've been solidifying things for a long, long time. We've been pouring molten metal into a variety of shapes for thousands of years. So why are we still studying this? Why still bother? Well, we're pressing too many buttons, but also doing this now. So additive manufacturing bumped solidification velocities from velocities thousands of times slower to 0.1 to 2 meters per second, which is slow for a plasma, fast for a metal. So just to give a quick background about what I mean when I'm talking about solidification, it's probably what you expect. We have some phase diagram. This is for the aluminum silver system, which most of my work is in. In the solid state, we have the alpha phase, the gamma phase, which is an intermetallic between aluminum silver. But where we start every time is in the liquid phase, and what I'm really interested in exploring is what goes on in this region when you go from some liquid above the liquidus to a material below the solidus. Because as you cool through here, you don't just form these phases, you have partitioning that occurs during solidification. So when you form a solid at some undercooling, because liquids don't like to just become solids, there needs to be a state where the solid has a lower thermodynamic free energy than the liquid, otherwise nothing happens. Liquid atoms don't want to just rearrange into solid atoms on the fly. So you form a solid with some composition over here, and then as you do that, you reject solute into the liquid, which means your liquid now has a lower melting point than it did before that solid formed, and that means you have a potentially higher thermodynamic driving force to solidify in that enriched liquid than you did before. So because of that, you can have an unstable interface where this liquid that's ahead of the solid-liquid interface wants to be a solid more than the liquid that's at the solid-liquid interface. And depending on how high your thermal gradient is, you can either drive into that low undercooled liquid and form solid that becomes a perturbation to the solid-liquid interface and destabilizes it, or you can have that interface become stable depending on your thermal gradient, or if you're solidifying fast enough, if that solid-liquid interface just rips through the liquid, then you don't care what the thermal gradient is anymore because it's solidifying so fast that the atoms don't have time to diffuse away from the solid-liquid interface, and you just freeze the composition in place. So in those 2 scenarios, if this is an unstable solid-liquid interface and this is a stable one, they can both develop perturbations, but the unstable interface is going to create a variety of patterns, and the stable interface will say no to the perturbation and melt it back to remain as a planar front. And in the case where you develop patterning, these patternings are evident in the solid state after solidification because you have partitioning along this growth front. So these grooves in between those needle-like features, which can either be cells or dendrites depending on your instantaneous conditions, will be enriched in solute, and the cores will be depleted in solute. And in the real world, we also care about real-world conditions such as convection and boundary conditions. So this is from some X-ray radiography at the Advanced Photon Source. And this is a melt pool right there. You can kind of see convection in it. This is a video, but the video has a strobing effect that feels irresponsible to just broadcast to a room of people that might have sensitivity to it. So 2.7 milliseconds later in this same melt pool, same laser parameters, same sample, nothing's changed except the boundaries were continually getting hotter because the relative heat input of this sample was too much for how thick it was. And we eventually started forming a bit of metal vapor at that liquid, and then that indentation made the laser absorptivity get higher because of the change in geometry, which drove the indent deeper, and then you get something like this, which you can imagine has drastically different conditions than here. So in the real world, we need to care about that. To simplify our lives, how am I doing that? To simplify our lives, we use a technique called dynamic transmission electron microscopy. So in this, we take a 50 nanometer thick amorphous silicon nitride substrate and sputter our alloy onto it, and then put it in a vacuum chamber. While inside the vacuum chamber, we melt a small portion of it with a laser beam, and then we watch the melt pool solidify using an electron beam. So you can see here, over time, the melt pool shrinks, and depending on the length of the major and minor axes of an ellipse that we can fit to it, we can extract our solidification velocity, which is directly useful in correlating to what we get out of the solidification process. So at the low silver composition alloys that we tested, they start with an unstable solid-liquid interface. You can see those grooves that I talked about earlier in the background slide have remained in the solid state and are fairly strongly partitioned. And as you go further along into the solidification front, the velocity increases. And as that velocity increases, you eventually cross the threshold into absolute stability, which is what we call the velocity so high that you just stop partitioning and get a planar front. But it doesn't occur instantaneously. As we're approaching absolute stability, the partitioning coefficient decreases, and you can see a drop-off in how strongly partitioning the solid-liquid interface is before we go all the way to a non-partitioning planar front. And that threshold for where we go to a non-partitioning planar front also varies depending on the orientation of the grains. So you can see this grain has a higher velocity threshold than this grain, which switched over to absolute stability much sooner. And then as we go up in silver, we have a completely stable solid-liquid interface, no partitioning, perfectly homogeneous solid, which is actually fantastic because a lot of what we do for post-processing in additive manufacturing is getting rid of all the partitioning that happened from solidification. So if we could just start with a homogeneous solid, then that'd be great. So this lets us actually do that, except for at the zone where we remelt between pools. But it doesn't fit the equation that we use to predict when we get a fully stable interface. It says that as we increase composition, it should be a higher velocity, and this is a lower velocity. So that doesn't work. Why not? Well, there's a variety of reasons, but the short answer is we're breaking almost every assumption the equation's derivation made. So it assumes that we have a constant slope for our liquidus, and we don't, because as you increase in velocity, you don't use the equilibrium liquidus anymore. You have to use the metastable liquidus as your velocity increases, because eventually the solidus and the liquidus converge to the T0 line, which is simply where they both have the same free energy. And because of that curvature in the solidus, we introduce curvature into the liquidus, which the equation was not built to handle. We're also reducing our partitioning coefficient to eventually 1, partitioning coefficient simply being the ratio of solid composition to liquid composition. And the equation was also built with the assumption that we're looking at dilute alloys, and 15, 17 atomic percent silver is a bit far from dilute. So going up even more in silver content, we don't even have that temporary planar destabilization at the interface between melt pools anymore. It's just a fully stable solid-liquid interface all the way through. We don't get any partitioning. But when we reheat that first melt pool with a second melt pool embedded inside of it, we do get some precipitation. So why do we only get precipitation in the high silver composition? Well, these precipitates are forming along dislocations, and we have those dislocations in every composition, but they're only becoming precipitated dislocations at the high silver content. And that's in part due to how much higher the driving force for precipitation is with a more supersaturated solid. Because you can see here, during the second heating, you form a concentration gradient as silver diffuses towards the dislocations. And as it does so, the dislocations eventually develop precipitation along them. And it's not a continuous solid wall of precipitations. It's made up of a great deal of much smaller precipitates, as you can tell by the scale bar there. But that's still rather useful for preventing, say, reduced mechanical properties, because those long columnar grains that are typical for additive manufacturing aren't great for properties. It's sort of like if you built a brick wall without putting any bricks going in between, just stacking them right on top of each other. This can act to break up that structure, reduce the free path for dislocation movement, and increase our properties. And now, I also worked in the aluminum copper system, so I'm going to talk about that real quick. When I said that as you increase velocity, you switch to a fully stable planar interface, well, sometimes it's not all the way stable. So this is banding, which you can kind of tell by the way it looks. But as we increase the copper content, we go back to having absolute stability, but not before going through a region of banding. So what is banding? Banding is a microstructure pattern that develops during solidification where you oscillate between a stable and unstable solid-liquid interface. So you can imagine we start here, and then we're increasing velocity as we solidify, and it switches to a high enough velocity for planar partitional solidification to begin. But going from a partitioned solid is a lower free energy jump than going from a liquid to a non-partitioned homogeneous solid. So that requires more, releases more temperature. So the interface gets hotter and hotter as you grow as a planar front until eventually it gets so hot that you don't have enough undercooling to grow as a partitionist planar front anymore, and it slows down to cool down, and you go through partitioning when you do that, which leads to the cycles that you can see here. But the bulk composition isn't changing. A square here would have the same average composition as a square there. It's all partitioning laterally to the interface. And then bringing in some texture before I bring it all back together. So the as sputtered material that we start with is not necessarily randomly oriented. There's a bias towards the 110 direction out of plane. And then when we melt it and resolidify it, we actually get rid of that bias. So increasing copper content means we're decreasing the preference of this system to have a preferred growth direction. And of more interest than the out-of-plane direction is along the solidification direction. So I redid that analysis along an elliptical reference frame, which was interesting to program. And we see that same trend where we start with a weakly preferred direction for growth, and then we eventually just eliminate that. And that happens due to competition between the grains. You can see here that blue grain grows and is then outcompeted by its neighbors. So what about the grain competition during banding? Because grain competition is what's selecting for the textures that we eventually get. So if we look here, you can see this grain is initially growing in the same way as all of its neighbors, but once it switches to banding, when a grain initially transitions to that partitionless planar growth, it's able to rapidly sweep laterally and outcompete its neighbors and completely dominate the eventual texture selection. As you can see here, there's many grains, and now there are very few grains once we switch to banding. And when banding grains compete with each other, we get a very interesting grain boundary structure that alternates back and forth as the grains take turns trying to outcompete each other, while one grain is in a planar growth regime where it can grow very fast, and the other grain is in a partitioning growth regime where it has to grow slower. They go back and forth and form what a responsible person might call a stair-step structure, but I think it looks like cats cuddling. So that's everything. If you have any questions about either solidification or my small beasts, feel free to ask.